Good morning, Spartans. Happy Wednesday, September 20th. You can see the agenda for today. We're talking the pre-dynasties of the Egyptian civilization, as well as the three Golden Age kingdoms that your book mentions. And then you have whatever time to cover questions 13 through 16 of the Chapter 2 reading guide on Egyptian culture, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But let's get down to it and see if I can cover 4,000 years of human history in about 15 minutes. Your book told you that the people who moved into the Nile River Valley occurred at about 12,000 years ago. I just want to point out the ancestors of what would become the Egyptian civilization, the Egyptian empire, moved into the Nile River Valley approximately 12,000 years ago. People have been moving through this region for hundreds of thousands of years. All right, people have been migrating in, migrating out for a very long time. The ancestors of what would become the Egyptian civilization, they first came into the region about 12,000 years ago. They were hunters and gatherers, which means they moved throughout this region, migrating north and south for a period of time. It wouldn't be until about 6,000 years ago that we start to see permanent civilizations begin. And again, this lines up with the agricultural revolution that we've talked about. While this region is a desert today, I do want to point out to you that 12,000 years ago, this region wasn't a desert yet. All right, it was kind of a marshy swampland type region. It was still in the transition from a tropical grassland tens of thousands of years ago into it being a desert today. By the time we get into the Egyptian civilization as we know it, about 4,000 years ago, 4,000 BCE, we see that this region has largely achieved its desert status that it still is today. It's the desert status that allowed Egypt to exist as a civilization as long as it did. It's the desert that surrounds the Egypt civilization that makes it the longest civilization that's ever existed. They were isolated. People couldn't get in and out of the Egyptian civilization or the Egyptian territory very easily, because again, we don't do very well with desert conditions. There's a couple other geographic features that allow Egypt to be as successful and powerful and wealthy as they were. All right. One, they had a tropical climate year round because they're at or near the equator. They could grow multiple crops year round, giving them a surplus of food that kept their people fed and allowed for an economy to grow, right? That division of labor. Not to mention the flow of the Nile River, as well as the prevailing winds being in the opposite direction, allowed for economic growth and travel. The river flows from the south towards the Mediterranean Sea in the north, but the prevailing winds come from the Mediterranean Sea towards the south. So the winds go north to south, the river goes south to north. That makes the Nile River navigable all year round. They can move goods, people, and idea up and down river regardless of what is going on. Egypt used to be in two kingdoms, the upper and the lower. The upper is towards the southern end of the Nile River, while the upper is in the southern part of the Nile River. Again, we need to understand that the upper and lower is based on the flow of the Nile River. All right, so the southern part, or the upper Egyptian territory, is closer to South Africa, while the lower is in the northern part, all right, based on the flow of the river, the lower part of the northern part of Africa. The Egyptian civilizations, the two upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt will be united under a guy named Menes. He's also referred to as Narmer, all right? This is right around 3200 BCE that he will unite the Egyptian empire into one single entity. This will be known as the pre-dynastic period. Okay, a dynasty is a family of rulers. It's a hereditary title, right? Your father is king. You're the firstborn boy or even girl, depending on the time period. You take over, right? Some of these dynasties last hundreds of years. Some dynasties are shorter than others because, the children who took over for their parent was an ineffective ruler. Or what could happen is some of these dynasties ended because there was a power struggle between the other ruling elites of the Egyptian civilization, which we'll get to here in a couple of slides. All right. It's the descendants of Narmer, right, that will reign as pharaohs, right? I think your book gives you the definition of the great house. They're referring to the family. It's very much like royal families that used to rule Europe, that still continue to have some sort of title in England, for example, right? It's an hereditary office, but they controlled everything. They control the taxes, the government, the health and wealth of their civilization, as well as the religion. Three major time periods that we need to know after the pre-dynastic period. Pre-dynastic period begins with Narmer or Menes. Then we have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And these are obviously most notable because great things happened. I'm not going to get into particulars here, but some notables. The Old Kingdom is when we see some really great architecture amongst the Egyptian civilization be constructed. Makes perfect sense. All right. The Egyptian pharaohs are trying to establish a centralized government. They're trying to establish and maintain power. What better way to do that than to build monuments that illustrate just how the Egyptian civilization is, how great it is to be an Egyptian, right? It builds this sense of nationalism, this pride. It gives people something to be proud of. And if they're proud of something, that means they're happy. And if they're happy, that means they support the government. Right? In the 21st century, if people are unhappy, I can guarantee you the first people they're going to blame is going to be the government. We'll see that in this next election. The economy, touch and go. People don't have enough money. Prices are rising. I can guarantee you that's going to be a tough re-election campaign for Joe Biden. Speaking of these things that are being built, not only does it build a sense of pride and appreciation for your culture, it also gives people jobs. People have jobs, people have money. People have money, they can buy things. Right? Everything kind of has its role. The Old Kingdom, more or less in the 2000s BCE, will advance to the Middle Kingdom. Okay. The last century of 2000 BCE all the way up until about 1650 BCE. So this lasts a better part of 350, 400 years. This is referred to as Egypt's classical age. Great works of art, literature gets produced, right? The stories, the pictures that show how great it is to be part of the Egyptian civilization. It's called the classical age because it is a return to the Old Kingdom where they are building the pyramids, where there was this huge movement of architecture, construction. Between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom is referred to as the intermediate period. There's going to be all sorts of intermediate periods throughout the kingdoms of the Egyptian civilization. Those intermediate periods are typically known as time of conflict. Either you have foreigners coming in like the Hyksos, or you have a power struggle between the pharaohs and the other upper class members of society. Finally, we go into the New Kingdom, or what would be the last kingdom of or the last great kingdom of Egyptian territory. We see that they become an empire, and this is clearly marked of the time. Once humans have inhabited an area and they have built up that area, the next thing to do is to expand. The expansion allows for continued growth. It allows for employment, new jobs being created as population continues to increase, right? If your population is increasing, but you're not expanding your territory, you're going to run out of jobs. Expanding into new territory requires a military. Expanding into new territory requires settlement. Expanding into new territory requires building infrastructure. All of these things create jobs. Not to mention, all of these things result in new resources being found, which makes your country more wealthy. Regardless of what kingdom it was, whether it was the old or the new or the middle or the pre-dynastic, Egyptian civilization was always divided into two groups: your servers, your farmers, your peasants, low class, lower class. Then you had your upper class, the royal family or the pharaohs, the priests and the scribes, typically those who were educated. By and large, most of the intermediate periods, the transitions from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom, by and large, those intermediate periods were caused by conflict between the royal family and the priests. And that conflict was largely due to this, quest for more power. There were a couple examples of foreigners coming in and disrupting things, right? The Hyksos, you read about that. We could also talk about the Greeks that came in the 4th century BCE, or you could talk about the Romans that came in the 1st century BCE. But again, largely it was political conflict between the upper classes. The Hyksos, they're going to be foreigners who invaded from Asia. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not they caused disruption and seized power, or if they were more or less able to rise to power during one of those intermediate years. The argument that they didn't necessarily come in and conquer is the fact that none of the old temples were destroyed. But again, just an example of how foreigners can come in. Now, I'd imagine some of you must have heard me say that Egyptian civilization is relatively isolated, and it's hard to get there. This is correct, unless you come in from the north and you can travel up the Nile River, which is exactly what the Greeks will do, and is exactly what the Romans will do later on. Let's talk about the beginning of the end of the Egyptian civilization. Some of the political strife that was caused in those intermediate years, regardless if it's old to middle or middle to new, was over religion. And religion was directly related to how much power people had. And we have Amenemhat and Queen Nefertiti. One of the things that they did was change the religious opinion, the religious philosophy of Egypt, and this caused great consternation amongst the priests. Nefertiti and Amenemhat wanted to encourage the power, the prestige, the role of the Sun King, Aten. Now, it makes sense why they want to do it. The sun is very important to these ancient civilizations because without the sun, you don't have food. But changing deities and changing the role of deities obviously could put the priests in a precarious situation. If these priests are, leading worship of, God 1, God 2, God 3, whatever it is, this means they're no longer necessary. They're no longer important. They've become obsolete. And that caused some conflict, right? It's these types of conflicts, again, that cause transition from the various kingdoms throughout Egyptian civilization. Nevertheless, Amenemhat and Nefertiti will eventually die, and Egypt will, due to the presence of priests and other upper class Egyptians, kind of revert back to that polytheistic religion of various diverse gods. Near the end of the Egyptian civilization, we come into Ramses II. He wasn't the last king, wasn't the last pharaoh, but he was one of the last successful pharaohs of Egypt. And again, he does everything that existed in the old, middle, and new kingdoms. He increased monuments, he increased temples, he increased the number of cities. He created jobs for people to do. All right? Carried out successful campaigns. He expanded territory. Brings in more resources, creates more jobs. Again, trying to give the Egyptians something to be appreciative of, proud of. Improve their disposition in life. The easiest way to get yourself thrown out of a leadership position is to make people unhappy or to keep people unhappy. You want to be an effective, long-lasting leader? Keep your people happy. That's exactly what he tried to do. He's known as Ramses the Great, okay? Restored a lot of power to the Egyptian empire. And again, improved the quality of life amongst his people. However, no one lives forever. Eventually, he will pass away. He'll be replaced by ineffective leaders, as happens from time to time. Infighting will ensue between priests, with foreigners who are there. There'll be this grab for power, and eventually what will bring about the end of the Egyptian civilization as a independent, self-ruled Egyptian civilization. First will be the invasion of the Greeks, people like Alexander the Great, and then later on, the following century, we'll have people like Augustus Caesar, Julius Caesar, who will come in with the Romans. Ooh. A lot of information coming at you for, good 4,000 years of human history. You're off onto the Chapter 2 Reading Guide questions 13 through 16, where we'll look at Egyptian culture for tomorrow. Hope you're all doing well. Please make sure you're listening to Mr. Veith, and I'll see you guys virtually tomorrow. Until then, go Spartans.